Spending yet another weekend trashing yet another member of Congress who happens to be of color on Twitter. This time it's the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Elijah Cummings, and his West Baltimore district. The first of the president's two-day attack came on Saturday when the president claimed the Maryland congressman's district is a, quote, disgusting, rat and rodent-infested mess. If he spent more time in Baltimore, Trump continued, maybe he could help clean up this very dangerous and filthy place. In another tweet, the president wrote, quote, why is so much money sent to the Elijah Cummings district when it is considered the worst run and most dangerous anywhere in the United States? No human being would want to live there. Where is all the money going? How much is stolen? Investigate this corrupt mess immediately. The president continued his attack yesterday, quote, if racist Elijah Cummings would focus more of his energy on helping the good people of his district and Baltimore itself, perhaps progress could be made in fixing the mess that he has helped to create over many years of incompetent leadership. His radical oversight is a joke. In all, the president sent or shared 15 tweets attacking Congressman Cummings in the city of Baltimore over the weekend. And actually had a member of my family who worked in Elijah's outreach office and saw firsthand every day how hard he worked to meet the needs of his constituents and really a family that he made out of his community there. These tweets are beyond offensive and beyond inaccurate. Joe?
So, Karine, this has become far too predictable. Donald Trump, of course, continuing to attack people of color. I talk about the signal on the ground noise. I must say, though, what is obvious to everyone, the pace of his racist attacks are quickening. The pace of his aberrant behavior, the intensity of his aberrant behavior is increasing, and the president actually does make it very difficult not to do exactly what he wants us to do, and that is report on just how bigoted he has become.
That's exactly right, Joe. Look, let me just say this about Congressman Cummings. Donald Trump is upset because Congressman Cummings is everything that Donald Trump is not. He is calm. He is smart. He is thoughtful. He actually works for his constituents. He's a good public servant. He is the example of the American dream, sons of a sharecropper who is now the chair of a very powerful committee. Donald Trump is threatened by Congressman Cummings. Look, I know people say, and folks are saying to us, we have to ignore the noise. We have to ignore the tweets. We can't give Donald Trump the conversation that he wants us to have about racism, but we have to continue to fight racism. We cannot turn away. We cannot look back, because what Donald Trump's racism is a toxic and dangerous brew. We've known Donald Trump has been a racist for a very long time. That is not surprising. But now he is in a position of power where policies are coming out of that position of power. Look, we know that white nationalists have been around for a long time, but Donald Trump is giving them comfort and enabling them. And so now we also see an increase in hate crimes. So we cannot stop talking about this. We cannot turn away. We have to continue to call this out.
And as Kevin Cruz wrote yesterday, Jonathan Lemire in the New York Times, there are echoes of George Wallace and Donald Trump's inflammatory racist rhetoric, except for the fact that actually Trump is far more specific in his racist attacks than even was George Wallace, who would regularly talk about agitators and pointy-headed bureaucrats. Donald Trump actually calls out people by name, and because he's president of the United States, we've seen this time and again, puts their safety at risk.
That's right. I mean, he has certainly never been a president or presidential candidate since Wallace who's wanted to make race more of an issue than Donald Trump. And it is his opponents of color or those cities that are traditionally or minority majority, places like San Francisco or Oakland or Ferguson or Chicago, places that are led by people of color, by politicians of color. Those are his targets time and time again. We have seen, of course, just in the last week or two, his repeated attacks on those 4 congresswomen of color. He has gone after Congressman John Lewis, a civil rights hero, time and time again. This is someone, and let's point out about Representative Cummings, too. He oversees a powerful committee, the House Oversight Committee, that just last week authorized Cummings to have subpoena power to look at Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's work-related emails, which people close to the president have suggested was one of the triggers here to unleash this torrent from the president over the weekend. But let's remind this again. He talks about Congressman Cummings' district. You know who else's district that is? That's Donald Trump's district. He's the president of the United States. He's the president of the entire United States. And even these places that he criticizes, that at the end of the day, that's under his jurisdiction. That's under his watch. And it underscores time and time again, there's never been a president who is more quick to say, that's not my problem. It's us versus them. Those aren't my people. And that is what he has done here again today.
Yeah, and of course, James Fallows, that district also received less in tax cuts than large multinational corporations like Amazon. I mean, every person in Baltimore received fewer dollars in tax cuts than Fortune 500 companies. And just give us a little perspective on Baltimore. It has been a city that has been suffering since the 1960s, long before Elijah Cummings ever received his first vote from the public.
Sure. Baltimore represents many of the big northeastern and upper Midwest cities that over the last generation plus have had a number of blows. There was the urban renewal plans of the 60s and 70s were, in retrospect, often ill-founded. In Baltimore's case, there were huge losses of Bethlehem Steel and other employers about the same time. So the traditional working class base of Baltimore was disrupted, as has been the case in Ohio and Pennsylvania. What's been the focus in Baltimore over the last generation has been there have been ambitious mayors. Martin O'Malley, let's remember, was the mayor of Baltimore. He had a very ambitious sort of statistics-based way of trying to deal with lots of the city's problems. And it has the crises or the challenges of other modern cities now, where parts of the economy are very advanced. Johns Hopkins Medical Center is right there in Representative Cummings' district, so is the Inner Harbor. And it has some of the most troubled areas with drugs and other things that you'll find in any city. But it is a slice of America in that way, as is any other big city that's coping with both the successes and the and the challenges and the tragedies of this era.
I mean, you look at Baltimore over the past 25 years, the Inner Harbor Project was an extraordinary step forward. What's happened with Johns Hopkins, Andrea Mitchell, also just a great step forward. Michael Bloomberg has had such a huge impact with that campus, and by extension, Michael Bloomberg's support for Johns Hopkins has helped that entire area. The best and the brightest students from around the world go to Johns Hopkins. Which of course is in Elijah Cummings' district. So yes, there are real challenges there. But you look at what happened in Macomb County this past week. Donald Trump, after promising people a plant would stay open, it's closed. The deindustrialization there is hurting. I'm wondering, Andrea, so we have all these racist comments coming from the President of the United States, who then, after making racist comments, calls Elijah Cummings racist. And yet Republicans silent.
Where are they?
Where are they? I just wonder, where are the Republicans yet again? And how do they think this is going to end when Donald Trump leaves town?
Exactly. Where were the George W. Bush Republicans? Where are the Republicans of Ronald Reagan? Where are the Republicans who have always spoken up on these issues for decades and decades? It was the Republican Party that actually inspired Condoleezza Rice's father to become a Republican, because he was reacting against the Southern Democrats who were leading the segregationist movement back then. It's shocking. Where are the Colin Powell Republicans? I cannot get over this. I mean, there are so many other issues to discuss, but the racism that is emanating from the Oval Office, and the real fear is that this becomes normalized, and that In
That's
fact,
correct.
our two-party system is going to be threatened by this because as the demography of our country changes, that people will not understand that there is a legacy to the party of Lincoln. And that legacy is now being destroyed precisely by the Republicans in the Senate.
And by the way, we talk about the legacy of the party of Lincoln. It was a great legacy. You could also talk about parts of Ronald Reagan's administration regarding immigration. And again, his farewell speech to America focused on immigration and the need to keep America vital by continuing to keep our shores open to people from around the world that would re-energize America every generation. Andrea, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.